1971 brought about a number of massive changes in General Motors' lineup with respect to the full-size vehicles. In particular, the previous generation that had run from 1965 through the 1970 model years was sunset, and in its place, a new generation of full-size cars was introduced for the 1971 model year. But for Buick, the change was a bit more profound than for other divisions. As for Buick, one of its shortest-lived nameplates would be introduced for the 1971 model year, and that was the Buick Centurion. Buick was arguably at quite a crossroads in the 1970 model year, and the lineup was transitioning from more performance-oriented vehicles to more luxury-oriented vehicles that perhaps the elder crowd was more accustomed to. To that end, by 1970, the Buick Riviera had evolved into something that was much different from what it was introduced as the 1966 model year. And Wildcat sales had declined to a little over 20,000 units per year from sales volumes that just the year prior had been touching about 70,000 units. Admittedly, though, Buick still had its heart set on some performance models as it introduced the GSX for the 1970 model year, which is arguably one of the best sports cars, certainly stylistically, that Buick made in its history. However, while the Wildcat was really marketed as a sporty model, the Centurion was marketed as something entirely different. That was really a mid-priced, middle-priced, near-luxury vehicle, right at the middle of Buick's lineup in between the LeSabre and the Electra. The Centurion name was lifted from a 1956 Buick show car that introduced a number of novel features to the American public. Chief among these was bucket seats, something that was super rare for American cars during the time period. And you may also notice that the Centurion has no outside rear view mirrors. This is because it had a backup camera to see behind it, and the display for the camera was in the middle of the instrument panel. Another novel feature was the fully transparent bubble top style roof that suggested sunroofs that were to come in future years. And while the 1956 show car was certainly quite radical, the 1971 Buick Centurion was really anything but radical. It was quite a conventional model in a number of ways, albeit it did have some interesting styling elements compared to the LeSabre and Electra. Most notable among those is the lack of the ventiports on the hood that the LeSabre had, as well as the Electra, although the Electra had 4 and the LeSabre had 3. The Centurion was outfitted with a different grille from the LeSabre and the Electra, having a horizontal texture in 1971 before transitioning to a vertical texture in 1972. It also had the Centurion logo on the hood as well as sail panel, different from the Electra and LeSabre. The Centurion also shared rather conventional underpinnings in that it borrowed its 124-inch wheelbase from the LeSabre, and it continued with that 124-inch wheelbase as well as the LeSabre's roofline through the end of its life in the 1973 model year. There was one distinctly different piece of running gear underneath the sheet metal, and that was that the Centurion in 1971 came standard with Buick's 455 cubic inch V8, making 315 gross horsepower. This was the first year for General Motors where its engines all ran on no lead or unleaded gasoline. It would take Ford and Chrysler at least another year to achieve the same feat across their entire lineup. The effect was that horsepower was downgraded from the 1970 455 that made 370 horsepower in Electras and Wildcats as well as the optional LeSabres, and now a buyer had to make do with 55 less horsepower. Horsepower ratings would further drop in 1972 as the industry switched from SAE gross horsepower ratings to net ratings, and the Centurion would come with 225 horsepower standard under hood. Optional was a dual exhaust version with 250 horsepower. Sadly, in 1973, the 455 was no longer standard for the Centurion, and it came with a 350 cubic inch engine that made only 175 horsepower. So in spite of the significant departure the Centurion took in philosophy versus the Wildcat, the car was actually we'll call it moderate sales success. The Wildcat, as you'll recall, sold about 21,000 units in the 1970 model year, and in 1971, Buick sold about 28,000 Centurions across the sedan, coupe, and convertible in the lineup. So about a 50% increase year over year in Centurion sales versus the Wildcat. In 1972, the Centurion expanded upon that performance and sold about 36,000 units. And in 1973, it even further expanded on that sales success, selling about 44,000 units. So what then happened to the Centurion after the 1973 model year? Well, Buick leaders presumably thought that Centurion buyers could simply pick between a LeSabre or an Electra, particularly given the many trims that both of the vehicles had at this point. The LeSabre having the standard and the Luxus, and the Electra having the standard model, the custom, as well as the limited. It was quite a full lineup. And again, while the Centurion was somewhat of a sales success, particularly for the 1973 model year when it sold over 40,000 units, it really just paled in comparison to LeSabre and Electra sales, both of which sold between 175,000 and 200,000 units in the 1973 model year. And I suspect that Buick dealers just had a hard time understanding where the Centurion fit in the lineup, especially after Buick had made the 350 cubic inch 4-barrel V8 standard in 1973. Taking away what was really a Centurion exclusive, and that was the standard 455 cubic inch engine. I suspect the Centurion was just viewed as unnecessary complexity, and maybe Buick had tired of making the Roman logo for the front of the hood as well as the sail panel. In any case, it ended up becoming one of the shortest-lived nameplates in Buick's lineup, as it just lasted for 3 model years and sold under 100,000 units cumulatively. But the Centurions certainly are good lookers from 1971 to 73, and though not that much different from the LeSabre and Electra, I kind of like the vertically oriented grille that some of them sport, and the lack of the ventiports I find candidly refreshing. So if you want a unique Buick, I would recommend picking up a Centurion. The 455 cubic inch Buick V8 is nothing but an excellent engine under hood. They have some relatively minor problems so long as you do good preventative maintenance and change the oil frequently. Most notably, the oil pumps on these are housed within the timing cover, and you sometimes have issues associated with that, and the water pumps in particular on these Buick V8s are a bear to get off and replace without breaking bolts. The bolts are relatively skinny. But other than that, and maybe some upper end oiling issues for the valve train that were largely fixed by these model years, the Buick V8 is really just another excellent V8 in General Motors' stable of great engines from that time period. Transmissions, again, are also excellent. The Turbo-Hydromatic 400 being under hood when coupled with the 455 cubic inch engine. So there's really just not much to worry about from an overall running gear perspective. The only unfortunate thing about these vehicles is that the interior quality really took a step backward over the previous 1965 to 70 generation full-size vehicles, and the body structures were much more flexible and less rigid, which created a particular affinity for squeaks, creaks, rattles, and things like that, particularly as the car aged and got more miles on it. So something to watch out for, and typical for the era, GM door sag, which seemed to be universal on the 2-doors and 4-doors that somehow the Chryslers and Fords of the era just didn't have. Thanks for watching this video on the 71-3 Centurion. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.